Greetings, folks. This is Scud with the Game Audio Institute, and I'm continuing sort of a thing that I just did with the previous postmortem on the constellation thing that we are doing in Metasounds in Unreal. Okay, and if you watch that video, basically the conclusion I came to was I'm abandoning Unreal. We're going to Unity instead. So one of the things that needs to happen when I get into Unity is I need to know that there's an engine that I can do procedural audio or generative audio with inside Unity. So I guess the first thing to sort of talk about is the state of procedural audio in terms of where things are at, nowadays in 2023. Um, so by procedural audio and generative audio, I mean individual notes that get triggered, or individual samples or drum sounds or whatever that get triggered in time by the game engine. Okay. And the first thing that I guess I'll mention in this particular case is that Unity cannot do this internally with any degree of accuracy by itself, in any robust kind of way. Okay. It just does not happen. Now, you can take larger things, larger objects, larger groupings like 4-bar phrases or 2-bar phrases or 8-bar phrases, and stitch them all together and have them happen at exact points in time and things like that. You can do that pretty easily and it'll work pretty well. You're using that usually, and you're going to be having to use in scripting, you have to use something called audio settings.dsp time. But all that being said, it's still not going to get you to this point if what you want is immediate generations of sounds on some sort of grid kind of thing, like individual sounds, individual notes, eighth notes, 16th notes, etc., that kind of thing. However, Unity is capable of working with lots of other cool tools that can allow you to do this kind of stuff, that can allow that kind of timing, that can also allow you to play synthesized sounds and things like that, and samples as well and stuff like that. Um, but but by itself internally, the generative audio, it just doesn't handle it very well. The timing is just not as good. There's actually a lot of stuff that's out there, and a lot of it will build for all kinds of platforms and stuff like that. So, and I'll detail as much as I can about what's out there. But I've got a very special interest in specifically looking at things that are going to build on the Oculus Quest. Now, what happened was about 6 years ago, roughly 5, 6 years ago or so, a lot of tools came out and they're able to do sounds in VR, but they had to be using basically Windows-based builds because they were not standalone Android. So what we're looking at are tools that basically cover this situation of ideally untethered, standalone Android builds. Now, I'll tell you whatever all of them support, because if you happen to be wanting to make, a Macintosh app or Windows app or anything like that, and you're not even interested in VR, but you want to have generative audio, yeah, then we've got some great tools for you. We can definitely do some really good stuff. But specifically for Oculus Quest VR, that's kind of what I'm looking for right now. And the list is short. So let's go take a look and see what we can find out there. The first tool we're going to take a look at is Pure Data. So this is an example of Pure Data. Pure Data is another data flow type of language environment overall, and it uses patch cords and things like that, and you can basically run things out and do stuff like that. Now, the important thing to understand is that you can make the patch and then it's saved as a patch, and you can do all kinds of cool stuff. And there are, in fact, some actual games that use Pure Data. In fact, pretty much all of the Lucky Frame, I believe Lucky Frame is the developer from Edinburgh, they use PD for all their sounds, okay? There's also a game called Fract OSC, FRACT-OSC, and that game all uses Pure Data entirely for its audio, basically, okay? But what we're interested in specifically is we need to focus on what's available to work with Unity, okay? And for that, I'm going to probably recommend this this one here. And this is called the LibPd Unity Integration. It's by Niall Moody, and Yann, I believe, also helped a little bit as well. basically what this is it's a libpd wrapper for Unity. Now, libpd is the thing that you should be aware of, okay? Libpd is the library that runs PD patches in Unity or in any kind of game engine, really. Um, but basically, specifically, Unity is probably the most common one. So the thing about this is that you're going to be running this libpd basically integration that runs inside Unity, and it offers a lot of cool stuff. One of the cool things that I should mention that it does do that is really, really cool is that it actually does allow instancing. So this is an interesting thing because normally in the early days of Pure Data, there was only ever one instance. And this is in fact one of the things that the Fract OSC developers ran into was it could only support one instance. So they literally had to make the synthesizer that would make all the sounds because they couldn't make one more than one instance of that synthesizer. So in other words, whenever you're making, whenever you have a prefab or something like that inside Unity and you spawn multiple copies of that to work, right? You would love to have an audio engine that can kind of do the same sort of thing, spawn different copies of itself so that you could get various things to work. So that it would also work in a multi-threaded kind of capacity for like multi-core CPUs. Well, that's now what this type of integration, this kind of PD Unity integration can do, which is a really awesome, awesome thing. It's really, really cool. It will support Mac OS Linux. It will also support building in iOS. What does it not support? It does not support building in Android, unfortunately. So that makes it not very useful for me. I should also mention that right now in this particular thing, there was no indication of support for Mac Silicon. So for those of you who have old Mac Silicon builds, it may not be useful. But this is where keeping an eye on the forks is helpful. So if you click that forks option, you can often find a situation in which someone has made a fork that will update some functionality that hasn't necessarily come back to the main repo. So if you do that, you'll find out that there's this Thomas Vanta, and he's got one that does support the Mac Silicon. However, again, this one doesn't support Android. So for me, not going to work. And there are projects by Yann Seznec in which right here at this here, I'll give links down below for all this sort of stuff. But right here, this is an example of Unity and PD working together. And Yann Seznec has got a project that he did with Niall Moody, also that he kind of does a little dev diary for, so you can get to see how they're making it work and stuff like that. So this is just simple, basic, like getting things set up, sending a bang, sending all, if you understand PD, you'll understand all these sort of things. But basically, that's the deal. So one thing I didn't mention about this, and some people might ask about this sort of stuff, is what about the heavy option that you can do with Pure Data? So for those of you who don't know, Heavy was made by a company called Enzien Audio, and what they did was they created an online compiler which would basically take Pure Data code and basically translate it into C++, which would make it run more efficiently, essentially. In that case, what ended up happening was they just sort of ran their own engine effectively. They used Pure Data for you to be able to design whatever you would want, but the end result would just be compiled into their sort of code. Which is really cool, and it was excellently used in game audio and talked about for a while. And then Enzien Audio went out of business. They did open source the compiler, but they didn't do any more work on any of the objects or anything like that. So there's a very limited number of vanilla Pure Data objects that can then be translated to Heavy, and that then creates a bit of a blockage because only a few of the basic things are going to run inside Unity in this Heavy configuration. So, and I don't know if it supports multi-threading. It might not. I can't remember if it did. At the time, PD didn't support multi-threading. So that was back in 2017, 2018. By 2020, that impetus got increased, and then versions of PureData were able to support multi-threading. But I have a very strong feeling that the heavy engine doesn't support, may not be able to support multi-threading. So that's one of the reasons I didn't really mention it too much here, even though it was for a while an exciting sort of option for especially game audio people to get generative audio inside the game. But unfortunately, sadly, no longer with us. So let's move on to Csound, and most specifically, we're going to be talking about Cabbage. Cabbage is essentially a sort of front end for a digital signal processing language called Csound that has been around forever. The earliest version of it probably came out in the 1980s. Yeah, before personal computers basically existed, just about. Not quite, maybe a little after that. So it's very, very old. It's been around for a really, really long time. And this is the latest version. It's a framework for audio software development. You can do some amazing things with this. You can make all kinds of plugins. You can make all kinds of instruments. You can make all kinds of effects, things like that. So the CSoundUnity integration basically allows all of these Csound patches to run inside Unity. He also has an excellent forum where you can do this kind of stuff. Now, here's the problem. Just like in PureData, you have to know a little bit about PureData to be able to do the work. And you also need to know about, in this case, you need to know about Csound. You need to be able to do Csound scripting, which is its own thing. It's got its own set of terminologies, and you have to learn how to deal with that, basically. But if you're using Csound's timing, it will work really good. Now, I'm going to mention this one pretty prominently because of the fact that I used Csound in my earlier version of Constellation, and it worked great. It worked really, really well. And so I'm very, very inclined to lean back into this, also because of the fact that the forum people are super, super helpful and super responsive. Rory, the developer, basically, he essentially gave me like a layer sequence, like an 8x8 layer sequence, all ready to go, all working perfectly fine with like a sine wave oscillator. And that was perfect. And like it was like a great starting point. And he actually just did that for me. So at that point, he'd already done so much work for me. I mean, a little bit of work for him, I'm sure it wasn't a big deal. But for me, it was like, wow, he gave me a really great head start. So I should just stay inside this framework and see what I can do. Now, one thing they've been definitely working on in this case is an Android build available for this particular thing. So again, this is one of those things where I'm very likely to try and make this one work. And we'll see how far we get. But Csound for Unity can build on pretty much all the platforms. They built it on Mac, Windows, Linux. They built it on Android. They built it on iOS. I'm pretty sure. So the idea is that you would use the Csound editor or Cabbage editor to be able to, run synthesizers or various kinds of things like that, or edit scripts, and then you use Unity to run those scripts inside basically the streaming assets basically folder, which is the same thing you're having to do, by the way, for pretty much anything that you have to do inside Unity when you want to use just raw information or raw data of some kind or another.